The moment my son threw my steak onto the grass and told me to chew with the dogs, I realized something inside my family had already been broken for a long time. I remember the smell of charcoal drifting through the warm Sunday afternoon air, the gentle crackle of the grill, and the sound of laughter from neighbors leaning over the white wooden fence. It was supposed to be a simple family barbecue, the kind we had held dozens of times over the years in the backyard of the house my late husband and I bought nearly 35 years ago. The lawn was freshly cut, the patio chairs were set out in a half circle, and the old oak tree cast just enough shade to keep the July sun from feeling too harsh. My name is Margaret Whitmore. I am 71 years old, and until that afternoon I believed that if you loved your family long enough and patiently enough, that love would eventually come back to you. My son Daniel stood at the grill wearing a baseball cap and a faded college t-shirt, flipping steaks with the same casual confidence he used when he was a teenager learning how to cook beside his father. Rachel, my daughter-in-law, stood near the patio table arranging bowls of potato salad and baked beans, smiling politely whenever someone complimented the food. Our neighbors chatted over plastic cups of lemonade, and my granddaughter Emily ran through the yard chasing a bright red ball that kept bouncing into the flower beds. It looked like the kind of peaceful American Sunday that people imagine when they think about family. I carried my paper plate toward the grill when Daniel finally lifted a steak from the grate and placed it in front of me. It was smaller than the others, but I didn't mind. At my age, you learn to appreciate small things. I thanked him and sat down in one of the patio chairs. The steak was warm, the grill marks dark and perfect, and for a moment I felt something close to comfort. Then Daniel looked over at me with an expression that felt strangely unfamiliar, like a stranger wearing my son's face. Before I could take my first bite, he reached down, lifted the steak from my plate, and tossed it onto the grass beside the patio. The meat landed softly on the green lawn. Not a splash, not a crash, just a quiet thud against the ground. Then he laughed. "Want meat, Mom?" he said loudly enough for everyone in the yard to hear. "Go chew it with the dogs." A few people chuckled awkwardly. Someone cleared their throat. Rachel pressed her lips together in a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I looked down at the steak lying in the grass, the juices slowly soaking into the blades of green. For a second, no one moved. The summer breeze carried the smell of grilled meat and cut grass across the patio. Emily's red ball rolled to a stop near my chair. I bent down, picked up the paper plate, and placed it quietly on the table beside me. No shouting. No argument, just silence. Because in that strange, quiet moment, I understood something far more unsettling than the insult itself. My son had not suddenly become cruel in the middle of a barbecue. Something had been building long before that steak touched the ground, and I had been too trusting to see it. The barbecue slowly returned to its rhythm, but something inside me had already stepped away from the noise and laughter. I remained seated in the patio chair, watching the sunlight move across the yard while conversations drifted around me like distant radio stations. Daniel flipped another steak on the grill and began telling a story about a project at work. The neighbors nodded politely. Rachel passed around bowls of salad with the same smooth hospitality she always displayed when guests were present. Anyone looking at our backyard from the street would have seen nothing unusual. Yet once a thought begins to form clearly, it refuses to disappear. I began to remember things that had once seemed too small to question. The first time had been nearly a year earlier when Rachel suggested that Daniel and I should put the house into his name for convenience. She had said it gently, almost sweetly, explaining that paperwork becomes complicated as people grow older. I had smiled and told her there was no rush for such decisions. Daniel had not argued then. He had simply nodded and changed the subject. A few months later, the subject returned again during a quiet dinner inside the kitchen. Rachel mentioned how expensive property taxes were becoming in the neighborhood and how difficult it must be for someone my age to manage a large house. Daniel kept his eyes on his plate during that conversation. I remember thinking that he looked uncomfortable, as though he were rehearsing lines that someone else had written for him. At the time, I blamed stress. Daniel had always been sensitive to financial pressure. I told myself that young families have responsibilities that older people sometimes forget. But the moments kept adding up. Rachel had begun organizing drawers in the house that had belonged to my husband. She once asked where the original property documents were kept, saying she was simply curious about the history of the home. Another afternoon, she casually mentioned several modern retirement communities located about 40 miles outside the city, describing their walking paths and quiet dining rooms, as if she were recommending a vacation resort. I had laughed politely and told her that my garden kept me perfectly busy. Now those small memories arranged themselves in a new pattern inside my mind. The pattern did not shout or accuse. It simply existed with a calm logic that was impossible to ignore. I looked again toward the lawn where the steak had landed earlier. Someone must have moved it while I was lost in thought, because the grass was empty now. The yard looked perfectly neat again, as if nothing had happened. Emily ran past me chasing her red ball and waved happily when she noticed me watching. I waved back and felt a quiet warmth in my chest. Children rarely understand the complicated strategies adults create. They simply move toward whoever treats them kindly. I realized then that I had spent the past year trying to keep peace in a house that might already be quietly planning a different future for me. And for the first time since the barbecue began, I allowed myself to ask a question that had been forming slowly beneath the surface of every polite conversation. If Daniel and Rachel had already decided what my future should look like, when exactly had they begun planning it? I remained on the patio a little longer than the others after the barbecue began to wind down. The neighbors slowly gathered their things and thanked Daniel and Rachel for the afternoon. Folding chairs scraped lightly against the wooden deck as people stood and stretched. The sun had started to dip lower behind the oak tree, and the long shadows across the yard made everything look softer than it had an hour earlier. Rachel began stacking paper plates into a plastic bag, while Daniel carried the cooler toward the garage. From a distance, they looked like a perfectly ordinary couple cleaning up after a pleasant gathering. Yet now that my thoughts had begun to connect the quiet details of the past year, the ordinary scene in front of me felt strangely rehearsed. I stood up slowly and walked across the lawn toward the garden beds where my late husband used to spend his evenings trimming roses. The soil still smelled faintly warm from the afternoon heat. I knelt beside the small wooden border he had built years ago and ran my fingers along the smooth edge of the wood. It was one of the last things he finished before he passed away 3 summers earlier. Back then, Daniel had stood beside me at the funeral with his arm around my shoulders, promising that I would never have to face the future alone. I believed him completely at the time. That promise had been simple and sincere, the kind that families make without hesitation. Yet promises sometimes fade quietly when new influences enter a household. I remembered another conversation from last autumn when Rachel had sat across from me at the kitchen table, holding a brochure from a retirement community located about 40 miles outside the city. She spoke carefully, almost gently, describing the walking trails, the organized dinners, and the quiet comfort of living among people my own age. She said it would give Daniel and her more space to focus on their careers and their growing family. At the time, I had thanked her for thinking of me, but explained that I was perfectly content in the home my husband and I had built together. Rachel had nodded politely, though the brief tightening in her smile told me she had expected a different answer. Daniel said very little during that conversation. He simply stirred his coffee and stared at the table as if he were trying to avoid choosing sides. Standing there beside the rose bed now, I realized something that felt both sad and strangely clarifying. None of the moments I had remembered were accidents. Each suggestion, each quiet conversation, each careful question about documents or property had been part of a longer path leading somewhere very specific. The barbecue had simply revealed the final step of that path. I brushed the soil from my hands and looked back toward the house where Daniel and Rachel were still moving around the patio. Their voices floated through the open kitchen window, calm and casual. Anyone listening would assume they were discussing nothing more serious than leftovers and grocery lists. Yet I understood now that the real conversation had been unfolding slowly for months behind those ordinary words. And for the first time since my husband passed away, I began to consider a possibility that had never crossed my mind before. If my own family had been quietly preparing a future without me in this house, then perhaps it was time for me to prepare a future that did not depend on their plans at all. I stayed in the garden a few minutes longer before walking back toward the house. The backyard had grown quieter now that most of the neighbors had left. The grill was cooling beside the patio, and the smell of charcoal still lingered gently in the evening air. Daniel was inside the kitchen, rinsing plates in the sink, while Rachel wiped down the counter with slow, careful movements. Through the window, I could hear the faint hum of the dishwasher starting its cycle. Everything looked orderly again, as if the afternoon had been perfectly pleasant from beginning to end. I stepped into the kitchen and placed my empty glass beside the sink. Daniel glanced at me briefly before returning his attention to the faucet. "Did you enjoy the barbecue, Mom?" he asked casually, the same way someone might ask about the weather. His voice carried no sign that anything unusual had happened in the yard earlier. I nodded once. "The weather was beautiful," I replied calmly. Rachel smiled politely and continued wiping the counter, though I noticed she avoided meeting my eyes directly. The silence that followed felt thin but stable, like ice that might crack if anyone stepped too heavily on it. After a moment, Daniel dried his hands with a towel and leaned against the counter. "You know," he said carefully, "Rachel and I have been thinking about something that might make things easier for everyone." His tone was soft, almost rehearsed. I had heard that tone before during the quiet conversations I remembered from earlier months. Rachel folded the dishcloth neatly and placed it beside the sink before joining him. "We just worry about you here by yourself," she added gently. "This house is large, and maintaining it must be exhausting. There are wonderful communities designed for people who want comfort and support." I listened without interrupting. Their words sounded thoughtful on the surface, yet the calm certainty in their voices revealed something deeper. This conversation had not begun today. It had been practiced many times before the moment finally arrived. Daniel crossed his arms and looked toward the dining room window rather than at me. "There is a retirement community about 40 miles north of here," he continued. "They have walking paths, dining halls, and medical staff available all the time. It might be a good step for the future." For a few seconds I studied their faces quietly. Rachel looked hopeful, Daniel looked cautious, and both of them waited for the answer they seemed certain would come eventually. I folded my hands together and allowed a small, thoughtful smile to appear. "That sounds like a very peaceful place," I said gently. Their shoulders relaxed slightly, as if a tension they had carried for months had finally begun to ease. Rachel nodded with visible relief. "We only want what is best for you," she said warmly. I looked around the kitchen then, at the cabinets my husband had installed himself, at the old clock above the refrigerator that had ticked through decades of family dinners and quiet evenings. The house had always been more than wood and paint to me. It was the history of a life carefully built. Yet in that moment I realized something important. Daniel and Rachel believed they were guiding my future. What they did not understand was that I had just begun thinking about it myself.